This is not country for old men. Age of narrativity, exaptive anti-narrativity. It's widely accepted view in many social sciences, as well as in law and medicine. The experience our lives as a narrative, a story, or a collection of stories. Galen Strawson called this an empirical, descriptive thesis of psychological narrativity, as opposed to normative ethical narrativity, according to which the good life must be narrative. Within psychological narrativity, there are strong proponents of the idea narrative identity. Then an important constitutive element of our identity is the shaping and internalization of a self-defining life story that tells us where we come from, where we are now, and where we want to go to the future. The time frame of my presentation only allows me to provide some evidence against the thesis of narrative identity and to argue for an exaptive anti-narrativity as a good life. The first comprehensive theory of narrative identity was developed by psychologist McAdams. Narrative identity is a history of internalized evolution of self, recreated by a given agent over a lifetime to see her life as meaningful and hopeful. According to him, identity can be modeled as a life story, as a comprehensive, large biographical novel with great chapters of life focusing on episodes of psychological significance. Jerome Bruner believes that people's spontaneous, comprehensive autobiographies follow well-recognized literary genres. According to him, life is not only an imitation of art, but also an appropriation of its genres and other means of storytelling. It is clear that the two prominent psychologists of narrative approach both use literature, including the narrative genres, as an analogy. This obviously implies that something that is a minimal sense of narrative cannot be used in itself for anything, not even as a model of identity, since it must have some form. I think what makes the narrative identity thesis meaningless is that narratives has no intrinsic values. Many narratives are distinctly boring, incoherent, meaningless, misleading. Narratives have to fight for quality, and whether they are valuable is determined by criteria with a given narrative practices. For example, the artwork practices for artistic narratives and the scientific work practices for the scientific narratives. Literary narratives are interesting to use because their structure, plot weaving, language use, and shaped characters enrich us in a countless way if we delve into them. Behind the biographical narratives, there is no constitutional system embedded in comprehensive life practice that would select, equip autobiographical narrative writers with criteria, theories, and mastery. McIntyre, one of the most prominent advocates of ethical narrativity, argues that the unified love narrative that underpins a good life must be linked to a comprehensive social practice that strives for excellence. According to his interpretation, when Aristotle speaks of excellence, he often thinks of well-defined practices such as playing the flute, war, geometry, and portrait painting. The practice of portrait painting is a story evolving from the late Middle Ages to the 18th century. According to McIntyre, from Giotto to Rembrandt, painters are aiming to refine techniques to allow increasingly accurate optical reproduction. An artist is authentic if, as a character striving for excellence in the narrative that captures the given developmental process of artistic practice, he shapes the unified narrative of his own creative life according to standards of excellence. This is how McIntyre understands authentic human life in its generality. The unity of the self is given by the narrative unity that connects the birth, life, and death of a person who lives his life according to the standard of tradition of achieving good. I believe that this extension does not work today because in the 21st century, human life does not have a unified, consensual practice across the globalized world that would provide goals, feedbacks, and criteria, standards of excellence in the creation of narratives. The insight at the time of the great narratives was thematized in the wide variety of ways in Central Europe in the 1900s. In my reading on Robert Musil novel, The Man Without Qualities, he sees the monarchy as the age of Schumpeterian creative distraction. The creative distractor is a person without qualities who does not cling to and cannot be characterized by any his substantive qualities. Musil insightfully anticipated the gap between the narrative construction and the true self that seems been empirically proven by social psychology. According to him, the narrative self is a maladaptive simplification that lost its meaning in the age of the dethroning of idiocracy. One of the main weaknesses of the narrative approach is that we tend to distort the past when creating our retrospective narratives, and we are unwilling to confront the fact that we are actually changing very quickly in the present. According to psychologist Daniel D. Gilbert, people regardless of age believe they have changed a lot in the last 10 or 5 years, but they will change a little in the future. In the present, they have finally become those who wanted to be in the past, who will remain much the same in the future. They live in the illusion of the end of the history, which runs the risk of making their decision about the future based on their present preferences. The main problem is that life is an anti-narrative, because we don't have narrative or lives, we live them. We are both spectator and protagonist in a quasi-movie of our lives, and we can only tell what happened to us once we have lived it. We do not live our lives in story sequences, but in a flow of experiences, always interpreted and arranged in some narrative sequence afterwards. Life is which well modeled in the film No Country for Old Men, is a series of unpredictable, unexpected trials in which the characters confront their own fate in the context of possibility, free will, and destiny. Our lives and future doomed to dramatic ordeals are as uncertain and as the outcome of the famous coin toss in the film, life or death. Narrative identity is a construct of remembering self, which is indirect to the duration of the story. Only climaxes and the end of the story influence the reconstruction of the past. Kahneman distinguished between the experiencing self and the remembering self. The former answers the question, feeling good life. The last question, however, what was it like overall? From our life experiences, only what the remembering self retains for us remains. The perspective of the experiencing self is ignored in our retrospective narratives. At the end of my presentation, I briefly outline a possible model for bridging the gap between narrative identity and the experiencing self. It is the quasi-chemical reaction, the elective affinity of the exapted elements of the fragments of reality and of the artworks that create mental mixtures on which the self without qualities emerge. Exaptation is inherently a biological term, reuse something adapted to a particular function, such as a panda's wrist as a thumb. Proust's novel, In Search of Lost Time, demonstrates many of these elective affinities of reality fragmented and artworks. The protagonist Swan, when he unexpectedly hears Winter's Sonata, step out of cliched love narrative by accepting the music and reveals the happiness of a unique, unrepeatable singularity purged of its imposed concepts. This love without qualities cannot be traced back to any other kind of happiness that can be captured by general concepts. This musical phrase gives an anti-narrative form to the scatters moment of love, simultaneously distincting it from reality and bringing it into intimate proximity. Similar elective affinities triggered when Swan accepts Botticelli's Zipporah. The Sistine Chapel fresco gives new meaning to his love for Odette. While Odette's tired face, her commonplace being, is artistically beautiful, enabled, given a new perspective by aesthetic imagination through the Vatican masterpiece, that is, in Dante's words, the transfiguration of the commonplace. I believe that the possible means of bridging the gap between our self-image and self are metaphorical transfiguration resulting from the exaptive use of language, when words from different domains enter into an elective affinity with each other. The most exciting metaphor in art are those where we see our lives as the life represented in artwork and see depicted life through our own. What is actually happening here is the simultaneous elective affinity of two metaphors, József Kollár as Elizabeth Bennet and Elizabeth Bennet as József Kollár. In these Proustian anti-narrative moments, this transfiguration of the commonplace and the transfiguration turning into the commonplace occur simultaneously. Metaphorical elective affinities evoke oppositely directed intellectual and emotional waves that keep us from drowning in the narrative river of ideological identity creation that flows gracefully toward the fine estuary of explanation. This theory can be extended films. On the one hand, I can put myself in the position of Elizabeth Bennet by observing from her point of view, create imaginary copy of her thoughts, emotions, and attitudes. And on the other hand, I can project my own thoughts, emotions, and attitudes into Elizabeth Bennet. The character's creatively shaped and inspiring personality, which does not change after the finishing the film, is related to my blurred, ever-changing characters in two ways. Let's call this episodic life lived on the border of aesthetic and everyday perception based on a double acceptation.
Is there any question in Hungarian or English? Van kérdés magyarul vagy angolul?
Lehetséges akkor az, hogy esetleg a művészet az jobban képes megragadni más eszközökkel az embernek az önmagát, vagy valami ilyesmi, mint mindenféle képzőművészetek, amikre az előadás utal, mint mondjuk tudományos modellek, amik egységre törekszenek. Mi az oka annak, hogy a művészet az talán közelebb van?
Igen, ez egy nagyon kedvemre való kérdés. Ugye pont a múzeum a világot két részre osztja. Tehát az egyik az a racioid, a másik meg a non-racioid rész. És a racioid részet meg tudja ragadni a tudomány a maga általánosító eszközrendszerével. A non-racioid részben pedig az egyedi élményeket kell megragadni. Tehát az egyedi soha meg nem ismételhető élményeket. És a múzeum szerint az életünk, tehát a mindennapi ember életünknek ennek nagyobb hatása van az életünkre, meg hogy kik vagyunk ezeknek az egyedi, soha nem megismételhető élményeknek. Ugye ilyen a szerelem, a misztikus élmények és a művészet. Ennek a területnek a része, és sajátos művészi tehát megragadás révén lehet. Ahogy mondtam is, hogy az van ugye ott az Odettel már nincs jó kapcsolatban, meghallja ezt a szonátát, és akkor ugye valahogy tehát átéli ezt az egészet sokkal eredetibb és intenzívebb módon, mint amikor így ilyen általános fogalmakkal visszaemlékezik. Mert eszébe jut a nőnek nem tudom, az illata, a krizantém, és minden egyéb. Tehát az életnek a megismételten apró részein tulajdonképpen elfed a narratíva egyébként azáltal, hogy az emlékezőin ugye a tapasztalóint háttérbe szorítja, amikor emlékezünk.